Buongiorno, come abbiamo...
Good afternoon. As we announced, the exhibition on the 70 years of the Republic that was mentioned and officially opened this morning by President Mattarelli is made of the exhibition itself and by a series of meetings with the protagonists of such work, so that you will get a better understanding of the topics presented at the exhibition. So this very first meeting is about the very start of this exhibition, the idea that is behind that. And last year, Mr. Luciano Violante had this great idea because he said not many things are well known about our history. Many people do not know lots of data, and when you don't have knowledge about a process, you have problems in building up your identity. Every meeting will deal with specific aspects of this large topic: economy, culture, foreign politics. So we're going to try to make a sort of snapshot of the historic background, and certainly having seen the exhibition is going to be a great advantage. So the main purpose of these meetings is to provide you with basic knowledge, and we're going to adopt the lecture format. In other words, we're going to deliver a keynote speech. So those of you who are still attending university, this is going to be like university class. For others, it's going to be a nice comeback, and for others, maybe this is going to be something brand new. However, we're going to have a 45 lecture and then some time for Q&A. So all that will last an hour and a half. Totally, I thank Professor Violante once again for the decisive contribution he made in organizing this year's meeting and this year's exhibition. Thank you very much. I give him the floor. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Vittadini. And I think that it's important to acknowledge the work of a whole team that made this exhibition possible. First of all, I want to state a fact. Actually, the choice of the Republic came long before the Constitution. I mean, as you probably know, there was a double vote for the Republic and the Constituent Assembly, and so the Republic won, and that is why we have such a constitution. But remember, Republic is not just a sort of government setting. This is also a much more fundamental choice, because this setting comes from the critic to absolute power. Let's go back to ancient times. So the Republic and the Republican form stems from and results from criticism towards absolute power. So the Republic is not compatible with absolute power. So this is a very important difference. Let's start from that. And the key concept of the Republican tradition is the difference between the free man and the servant. This goes back to the ancient Greeks and Romans.
Libero e libero da...
And Cicero said that because the servant is very different from a free man. A free man takes part in the political life. So the free man can join the political life because it's free. So from Cicero on, academics talk about civil virtues. What does this mean? It's a way of doing and of acting leading to the creation of the so-called polis. And the free participation of free citizens to political life shows the lack of domination. But this is not anarchy, not at all, because there is participation. So this is a virtuous participation that needs to be strictly related to the fulfillment of civic rights. That means to commit oneself for the progress of the community, that means solidarity, and that means respect of laws and rules. So also the settlement of disputes, and in particular of political disputes, is very important. What does this mean? It means that institutions should not be involved in conflicts, and criticism to people is not criticism to institutions, and vice versa. And a conflict cannot be political and cannot be eternal. It must be ended at some point, and I'll give you some examples on that. So because of that, politics is very important for the Republicans, because citizens' participation is important, and as a consequence, politics is important and policy making is important, because the two things are strictly intertwined. But this is not the only democratic political philosophy that was developed. So first of all, we should consider a specificity of democracy, because Republicans talk about the lack of domination. On the other hand, for the supporters of liberal ideas, the importance is to be free from. And so citizens are very jealous of their rights and protect them and defend them. Liberalism is not very much interested in the participation of citizens to the political life. So duties are seen differently, because, liberalism focuses on rights and not on duties. And a liberal vision has a critical attitude towards politics. It is considered as too much related to interests and passions, and so there are too many conflicts of interest in this sense. So at this point, it seems that the Republican attitude is flawless, and the liberal attitude is full of flaws instead. But this is not exactly like that, because, Republican ideas achieve and, aim at a certain level of ideal public participation, but then Republican ideas may lead to some form of Jacobinism. Think about the development of the drifting phenomena of the French Revolution, because that led to Jacobinism. So if you're an enemy of the Republic, it needs to be eliminated, because you may jeopardize the Republican idea. So we need to avoid such alteration of republicanism. Republicanism is not incompatible with authoritarian forms. So Jacobinism is a sort of distortion of the Republican ideal. So on the one hand, you can have sort of wrong and evil development of republicanism when it comes to Jacobinism, but the same applies to liberalism. Again, there is a dichotomy between liberal values and Republican values. But actually, when in 1946 Italians chose between monarchy and republic, well, the main reason for the choice was not what I just said, because on the one hand there was fascism, there was also the fact that the Savoy family just fled away and left the country in an abrupt way, and so the country was split. 54% of Italians voted for the Republic, and 45% roughly voted, 45.7 for the monarchy. Again, when it comes to key choices, well, people always have sorts of different opinions, but when in '69 in France there was a referendum on the Senate, the same sort of happened. So France was divided in two, was split in two. The US made a secession war because of being split in two. And one of the main causes was the abolishment of slavery. And that was a splitting issue, a big issue. So usually there is a big division when there is a big question. So the Republic deeply split the country. But then the ruling classes of the time were able then to get people united again.
Couple of examples. First of all, with the Togliatti administration, I believe even against the majority of his party, Togliatti presented an amnesty plan to cancel all the offenses committed by both partisans and fascists. Why? Because it was time just to move on, to get away from the past and move on. So even against the will of his party and on the basis of the requests made by other parties, Togliatti took on the responsibility to promote amnesty. Another example of this capacity was the Gasperi in 1953. In 1953, just before the political elections, after those of 1948, there were fierce debates and clashes both in the parliament and in the country. A law was passed that was called a cheat law, because a premium would have been awarded to the absolute majority party. And for just a few votes, the absolute majority was not accepted. There were millions of contested votes and null votes. So at that time, the main party asked for a recount of the votes, because in that million of null votes or empty votes, there was a chance to find the 50,000 votes that were necessary to have absolute majority. But the Gasperi opposed that, because he claimed that the country should have not been divided even further. So one could have lost, but it was important not to create divisions, create gaps in the countries. And this is so important because now we read headlines of these political leaders saying that the important thing is to win, but I say that the important thing is to govern well and not to win, and to govern, to keep the country united, not to divide it. That's the responsibility of our ruling class, and I think that these lessons from history are still valid today, because if the important thing is to win, we're all the same, and we just go behind the ideological part of the movement. There's no creation of the future because we don't consider what's important in the long term. So these lessons from the past really give us an idea of the fact that big issues really can create divisions and can split opinions, and it's not easy to find a common solution. So we were talking about the choice of the Italian people for the Republic and for the Constitutional Assembly, and then there was the issue of the values to inspire the Constitution. Generally, what is mentioned is a compromise between the great political cultures. One of the three young persons who posed questions this morning to the President of the Republic referred to the great culture. He skipped the liberal one. He mentioned Marxism, Catholicism and socialism, but two of these are quite close to each other, and then there was the liberal culture, which was important, but that student mentioned those kind of cultures. Anyway, this compromise did exist between these cultures, but it was the framework of two specific compromises. The first one concerns the functioning of democracy in our country, and the second concerns the constitutional status of citizens. What was the functioning of democracy? Well, the first compromise, don't be surprised by this, concerned the creation of an unstable political system based on a non-decision system. And do you know why? Because at that time there were two big blocks, the Soviet bloc with Communist Party and Socialist Party, and the Western bloc with the Christian Democracy, liberal parties and so on, and the other parties. Nobody knew who the winner would have been in 1948, and the alternative, please bear this distinction in mind, was not for government. It was an alternative concerning a whole system. That is, the political system would have been totally different depending on the winner. If the Soviet bloc had won, freedom of religion, of thought, of property and so on would have been shaped in a certain way, or maybe would have been reduced or extended. If the Western bloc had won, those kinds of rights would have been a totally different destiny. So you will understand that it's not just like today that we have to decide who is taking the power now, but there were two completely different frameworks. So what was the precaution of political forces? Because they were not trusting each other. Everybody was thinking that the winner would have used the rules against the opponent. So what did they decide to do? They said, well, let us not include the stability rules in the Constitution. Let's keep them outside. The Parliament shall represent, and the rules for stability and governability will be kept by the parties. There is a statement by Amendola, we have it on the slide here, by Giorgio Amendola. You can read that. In the Constitutional Assembly, there was a debate over the possibility to give our democracy a condition of stability with legislative norms. It is clear that democracy must have its own stability if it wants to govern and to fulfill its program. But it is not possible, Amendola states, to find this stability in legislative artifacts. There is this new and positive fact of the great democratic parties that are now a prerequisite for democratic discipline. Today, discipline, stability are given by political conscience that is entrusted to political parties. I think this is so clear. There's no norm. Discipline, order and governability is entrusted to the parties. After all, those parties were highly legitimized. Members of Christian Democracy, Communist Party and Socialist Party were more than 2 million. Today, maybe all the parties altogether do not get to 1 million members. Then those parties had led the fight against fascism, Nazism. They fought for the Republic and won. They convinced the majority of Italian people to vote for Republic. And during the escape of the Savoy family and the king from Rome, they even governed the cities, so they were highly legitimized. What was the difference between Italy? So what is the specific characteristic of the Italian constitution? Well, we can appreciate this if we make a comparison between the Italian and the German constitution. Why? Because Italy and Germany generated the two dictatorships of the 20th century, Nazism and fascism. They brought about the Second World War, they both lost it, and the two regimes went into pieces. But the two constitutions are very different. Consider that the Italian one envisages two chambers having to vote confidence, but it is also possible to have a vote of non-confidence from one chamber only. Additionally, governmental crises do not have a deadline, they can last months, and that was the case in the past. There is even a norm whereby the Chamber of Deputies, every 5 years, elections would be held, and the Senate would be 6 years. So this way it was possible to measure the approach of a country. So stability and instability issues really can be really understood with this different time frame of elections. But then this norm was never implemented because in 1953, 1958, the President of the Republic dissolved the two chambers, and that was a mistake by the Constitutional Assembly, because basically those deciding things were the parties. So in Germany things are different because confidence is only from the lower chamber, not the higher chamber, and to dissolve a government it's not easy enough to vote a motion of non-confidence, but in that motion the new chancellor must be indicated with the new alliance too. And why? Because while the two positions can agree on a negative stance in voting a motion of non-confidence, they may not agree on a proposal. So extreme right and extreme left, it's hard they find the name of a common shared head of state, head of government, but they may be well in line to dissolve the government. So there is a term, there is a deadline too for governmental crisis. If Bundestag doesn't appoint a chancellor within a certain time frame, it's going to be dissolved. So the difference between the two systems are clear. One system has stability rules in the constitution, another system put these rules in the hands of the parties. Within this framework, the second compromise also can be located. It is between republicanism and liberalism. So the first compromise is, let us keep all the stability rules outside the constitution and let's give them to the political parties. The second is maintaining an equilibrium and balance between republican and liberal parties, liberal values. I give you a couple of examples. For example, Article 2 of the Constitution mentions inviolable systems, the liberal system, and also irrevocable rules, irrevocable rights. So the Republic provides for both, for example, social solidarity, political and civic solidarity. Article 4 is an article that not many remember, but it's so important, and it reads, every citizen has the right to fulfill an activity, to associate in parties and to determine national policies and to contribute to society. So people are an active part of the political life. This is a Republican party, not a liberal party. And also another article says that there is a free economic activity, but that cannot be detrimental to social activity. That's a Republican principle. So I don't want you to lose too much time on this, but you'll find such a balance between the two poles. So this is a second compromise. It was not an imposition of Republican principles, not even of a Republican principles. So there was a balance. These were the two big compromises at the basis of the Republic.
Tenere le regole della stabilità.
First, keeping stability rules outside the constitution and leave them in the hands of political parties, and second, finding a balance between Republican and liberal values. Let us move now to the second stage of the constitution, which concerns the stages of the life of the Republic, these 17 years. They've been different, and I make a distinction that can help us understand how things worked. It's not really scientific distinctions.
1948.
The first stage goes from 1948 to 1978 with the assassination of Aldo Moro. The second stage goes from 78 to 89, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the second stage goes from 1919 up to now. The first stage is characterized by a prevalence of Republican values. Big social reforms, the healthcare system, kindergarten plans, the labor statutes, labor rules. These are all big social norms inspired basically by principles, Republican principles. These are also the years when ostracism and terrorism from right and left start. Detailed analysis would require a lot of time, but both trends are aimed at going against this kind of process of democratization of our country. In the documents found from the extreme right, what is said is that people must be punished because the people made mistakes, they made the wrong choice, and they should make different choices. So the terrorist attacks are against specific subjects, banks, squares, trains, for example in Piazza Fontana or in Piazza della Loggia or in Bologna railway station, the 2nd of August. These were all attacks against citizens. And terrorism from the left attacks specific targets. Anybody who may represent the credibility of institutions. For example, skilled journalists, skilled magistrates or policemen or political people. There is a sort of response in this way against civil processes that are advancing the country. Why do I choose the assassination of Aldo Moro as the end of this first stage?
Nella società italiana.
The end of the 60s in the Italian society, new values start emerging. For example, environmentalism, and the parties are for industry, feminism, and parties are not in line with that policy, and they're not understanding what's going on in society. They don't control society anymore, not even institutions, because many attacks are against institutions. So this is the historical compromise, and I was in favor of that, so I'm aware of that now. So that's the response between Christian Democrats and Communist Party on how to rule the country, on how to get things going on in a fine way. So Moro and Berlinguer are the protagonists, and the assassination of Moro makes this process impossible. The DC majority was against this, and the other party too, but the two political leaders were so highly esteemed in their parties, at least in my party that at the time was the Communist Party. What we used to say, well, it's better to make a mistake with a party and not to be right individually. That was not a great principle, but just to let you understand what kind of approach that we had. And also, just to let you understand what the situation was like, there was a joke saying there's in a pond, there's 3 frogs, and one asked the other, "Why are you here?" Said, "Well, I was a beautiful princess, and then a witch came and transformed me into a frog. And you?" "Well, I was a prince, a beautiful prince, and an evil wizard came and transformed me into a frog." "Well, I was a militant communist, and the party did it all for me." That's the way we ran this joke around about what was the situation. So what was going on in this stage? This stage ends with the assassination of Aldo Moro, but in the previous years, despite the lack of stability rules, the country advanced. And how is that possible? So let's go to slide number 8. That's not the slide number 8. It will come. Here it goes. The country managed to go ahead anyway. I want to thank the people managing the slides. There was not a real alternative in terms of government. This is the first thing. Second, there was an apparent instability of government. So before continuing to read this slide, I have an anecdote that I may have mentioned somewhere else. Kissinger, in his memoirs, mentioned a meeting with Aldo Moro. Aldo Moro was a foreign affairs minister at the time, and he says, "Minister, today I meet you, foreign affairs ministers, I'm pleased. And 6 months ago I met the Prime Minister of Italy, and there was another person. In 6 months I will meet the foreign affairs ministers, and I'm afraid it won't be you. Can't you just get some stability?" And Moro answered with his renowned wisdom, "Look, you have to be worried of the stability of the political line. Who is going to take it along is our business." So that's an interesting remark. The idea was about political stability. Before we said that each government would last 1 year in the First Republic, so please pay attention to this. That was a democratic guarantee, and do you know why? Since there was no alternative to Christian democracy and its allies, and there were different currents, what was the fear? The fear was that maybe one current would have got to power, and that would acquire excessive power. It would become too strong. So every year there was a way through which votes of motions of non-confidence, we could dissolve the government. And now have a look at item B. Stable ministers in transient governments. Out of 233 ministers and the presidents of the Council of Ministers, only 63 were appointed. 152 received 1,332 appointments. What does that mean? That the heads of a current was always in the government, but those that were maybe Minister of Defense for 1 term would not continue to be Minister of Defense, would have been moved to another ministry to avoid to acquire too much power. I remember in my life, I worked in the Ministry of Justice once, and I heard a dialogue between elder usher with a younger usher and say, how should I call this? Well, these young ones call them counselors, and the other ones call them excellencies, which works always fine. And these ones, the undersecretaries, those call them just you like, as you like, because they come and go. And it was indeed the case, because political representatives were always moving and changing. Then have a look at the lower part of the slide. Do you know what the secret vote is? Generally, this is a vote required by the opposition to go against the decisions of the majority. In the first term, 1948-1953, for the Atlantic Pact, there was a profound differences, and the majority law, out of 1,114 sittings of the chambers, only 175 secret votes were asked. In the ninth term, 1983-1987, which is the beginning of the crisis of political parties, out of 634 sittings, almost half of the previous ones, there were 2,485 secret votes. So when there is the crisis of political parties, there is no more possibility to have balance and positive compromise, so there is direct clash. I think this is very interesting, so you can understand how strong the parties can be, and so they can find a balance and agreement. But when political parties start being weak, they clash and they fight, and that's inevitable. You see, the theme of the meeting, you are good for me, well, that really should make us think, because this way that I showed you means that you don't acknowledge the other one. The other one might be right, and you actually fear to be weak compared to the other one, because if you believe in your strength, well, you have no fear. You might not have a debate and acknowledge that the other one is right. You might be fully wrong in your stance. But if you're weak, you're not going to do this. And when you are weak, you refuse to have a dialogue with the other. When one is strong, no problem listening to other people. What are the principles? So this stage was not really serene. It was quite hard, with attacks. And the most serious one was the assassination of Valdemoro. But I've selected some key points in this stage. The first one is managing conflict, to stop conflict. Second, defending the authoritativeness of institutions. This is a very important fact. And in this respect, I have a little story. When I entered Parliament chamber in 1979, the person sitting next to me, the member of Parliament next to me, was a bit of an exuberant character. And every time that a representative of the majority would take the floor, he would stand and shout and yell. The second time he did that, the secretary of the chamber, Mario Pocchetti, a distinguished colleague, said, he told me, look, tomorrow you'll have to talk to that guy, so be careful what you say, mind your words. So that was a political lesson. That meant you don't have to exaggerate in conflict, You have to measure words. So authoritativeness of institutions, nobody would ever say something wrong about the chamber, the institution. Maybe they would go against the specific ministers, the presidents, but never to the institution. Nilde Iotti was reprimanding the party when they were doing obstructionism, because she said, you are destroying the parliament, you're exaggerating, and you are part of that. And she was pretty harsh on this. And the third item It's a bit hard to explain. At that time, it was coming to a full maturity, not the case today. And that was the awareness of each political party for their role within the history of a country. Each political party should ask itself, what is the role in the story, in the history of my country? What do I want for the future? How do I want to build my future, my country? What kind of history do I want to implement? For this reason, debates were pretty high-level debates. There were also low-level debates, but I invite you to look for the speech by Aldo Moro about the Lockerbie scandal, in which some Christian Democrats or ministries were involved. That's a really high-level moment of our political history. There's no offense, there's no insult, but not because it was Aldo Moro giving that speech. It was really that kind of moment. The strongest sentence mentioned by Moro is this: and if you were wise, if you had wisdom, which we might doubt you have, so this is really the most provocative things that you might consider this a terrible insult. No, but that was a way to make a call for better equilibrium, for better balance. So these are the three most important things. The awareness of my role on the development of my country is fundamental for a country. A political party that does not ask itself this question is not a party, it's just a faction. Then the following stage goes from 78 until 89. And here, political parties start to develop a distance from society. There is a historical compromise, and then there is a document called the Forlani Preamble. I know that he actually had some health problems, so we really wish him well to recover soon. Forlani presented a document to the Congress of the Christian Democrat Party in 1980, in which he was proposing an agreement with the Socialist Party and to exclude the Communist Party from any kind of collaboration. The problem was not, should this be right, should this be wrong, but if you stop the possibility to talk to a political party, well, this is going to be really a catch-22 situation after all, because there's no way to have a dialogue, to have a debate. That's what happened at that stage. And at that time, the Republican spirit starts to weaken and liberalism starts to gain momentum. It's also the years of a strong presence of a social political party. And there's also Donald Reagan in the United States from 1981-1989, strong supporter of liberalism, and Margaret Thatcher in the UK, two big personalities that are against solidarity. They are for the individual. But Margaret Thatcher said, the people doesn't exist, there's just the people, there's just the individuals. So these two representatives influenced profoundly these 10 years from 78 to 1989.
Slide numero 9.
Now I would like to show you slide number 9. This is public expenditure. You see a peak here in the 80s. Why is that so? You know why? Because that's the year of the parties holding institutions, putting their hands in institutions, and so public expenditure is being used to keep the country united. So it rockets. There's no way to keep the country united with the rules, with the proposals, because there is a very, very hard clash between the different political parties, and so our budget is used for that. And we are still paying for this situation.
La fase che va da
Then let's move on to the third stage, from 1990 up to now. So between the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, there are four considerable events that take place. First of all, the end of international two-party system. The second is the Maastricht Treaty that would put some caps, some limits to public expenditure. The second one is the so-called Tangentopoli, or kickback city, or Bribesville phenomenon. And then there is the referendum to go from the proportional electoral system to majority electoral system. Maybe some people in this room voted in 1993. Why are these events important? Because the end of the two-party system internationally lead to the end of function that the Christian Democrat Party had to stop, to buffer communism and Communist Party. Cossiga already anticipated the crisis and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and he said, my colleagues didn't understand, but they will be the first ones to fall under those rubbles, because the Soviet system is more useful to them, because the fear to that system would channel votes in that direction, but when that system crumbles, there's no more reason to vote for that. And all those supporting economically that country together with other countries, even if this is in lesser extent and the opposition, well, there was this fear of the communist ghost. When the ghost is gone, well, we don't have to pay anymore. In fact, before we are asked to go to court that we paid, we will tell the truth ourselves. And then there was this Tangentopoli, kickback city phenomenon, and so on. Then we have the referendum in 1993, in which the idea of a majority system prevails. What does that mean? So the citizens want to choose themselves the majority that is going to run the country. The proportional system is a sort of waiver, but the majority system is a decisive one, because it is the citizens that decide what the majority is, and that's the system that is approved by the Italian citizens. Also, in these years, there is another phenomenon that is visible here in slide number 10. You see that before 1992, the Italian system was made like this. The columns are parties. Let's say there's the Christian Democrat Party, then the parliamentary groups, militants, and voters. Okay, so the vertical column is made up of these groups. So every election was determined by small numbers of votes being moved from one side or to the other. So convincing just one of those groups may determine the victory. But then in 1992, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and during the initial stages of Kickback City, something happens. That is, Silvio Berlusconi enters the political arena. He is not really from a political background. He's a business person, and he presents himself as a part of society that is against politics. I am the society, and all the others follow him in this respect. So here is when criticism of politics is started by politicians themselves. So there is this separation between the political world and society, and there is a mechanism of populist movements that have now led to today's situation with a big gap between the political world and society. Nobody mentions the importance of politics, of the primacy of politics and the positive effects of politics. everybody refers to that in terms of being part of society. So that's why there is this fracture, this gap between the two worlds. And in this stage, there is a strengthening of liberalism. There's a lot of ignorance actually out there. So there is an explosion of rights, but not of social rights. It's just individual rights, up to the point that the desire may turn into rights. So one just may wish something, and so he or she starts fighting for it, and then maybe one finds a judge that can be acknowledged, and so that's being settled. I was really surprised by an event that involved a weird character that invented apparently a treatment, a stamina treatment to cure cancer, but that was harmful actually. He made an agreement with the hospitals in Brescia, and so he was using the healthcare system funding to cover the expenses of this treatment. Then the government was a bit weak in stopping this treatment, and so there was a decree saying that that treatment could continue for those that had started but could not be administered to new patients. But that was kind of weird in the way it was formulated, but it was a fraud basically. So maybe many patients that, as we can understand, are desperate, they didn't start the stamina treatment, but they wanted to get access to it with the healthcare coverage from the state. So many judges against the law, since there is the right to health, which is prevalent, they ruled that even if that's only a psychological right, actually, because we don't know if that treatment works or not, but if the patient wishes to have it and they feel that they can be good, so let's approve that. That was the story. Or the whole issue of adoption. It has turned into the right to have a child on the part of parents, and not the right of children to have parents, but it's the right of parents to have children. That is why the judge selects the adequate, suitable family for that kind of child, the family that exists for that child. So the judge has to do this very hard job to find the right condition. It's not that you look for a child for that couple, but you know, the transformation of desire into right is legitimate, but not wishing a child. What is not correct is considering that you are entitled to something like that. That's different. Let us move on to the final stage. Certainly, the situation in our country is not easy, but this is not the case just for our country. So let us see slide number 12. This is from a study carried out by The Economist and shows the membership of political parties. You see, it shows up to 2010. Austria, Norway, Italy, Finland, Britain, Germany, and Spain and France. There is a decrease in every European country. Then the following slide. This is participation in voting in elections, voter turnout. I can add the data here. Over the last 10 years, the number of democracies in the world have decreased. So there's a stage of difficulty for democracy now. And I think that we should really take this into serious consideration, because some of the problems that we think it's our problem, they really affect the whole Western world. And why is that? And I'm going to conclude, because democracy is not just a government technique. It is a capacity to govern, to fulfill and defend certain values. I'll make a comparison. There were problems in Syria. President Obama had to debate with the lower chamber, the higher chamber. It couldn't really make any action. Putin, in a moment, sent aircraft to bombard them. He freed Palmyra and that area. He demined Palmyra and celebrated that with a big concert in Palmyra, which is a wonderful Roman site. So going beyond values, that system is much better than the American one. If you go beyond values, really democracy succumbs before authoritarianism. So the notion here to understand is that democracy is not just a governmental technique. It is linked to values, and those values guarantee that every single person can have a future in a country. Authoritarianism instead cancels the possibility to have a future for certain subjects. Of course, if you stand on the side of the winner, you'd better be with authoritarian systems. But that's not always the case. And then authoritarian systems are based on lies. But democratic systems are based on the quest for the truth. And that's why they are much more exposed. There's a censorship in authoritarianism, but in democratic systems, everybody can speak even when things do not go well. And this is taken on the part of a big part of the citizens as a sign of weakness in democracy. But actually, democracy has the tools to show things that do not work. This is a problem now present in all democracies. And here, there's a couple of remarks I would like to make. First, I would like to refer to Minister Scerba in 1960, who introduced the first political tribune. There is his allocution, and there is a recording here. We are in 1960. It was the first political tribune. Scerba was Internal Affairs Minister, and there were elections. It's slide 1 bis. So we're creating a little bit of suspense. As our guest said, I was invited to start this political debate as Internal Affairs Minister. I must admit that I was a little bit skeptical speaking on television, because we know that TV viewers are quite critical of political people. We would have preferred to present some other representatives or figures that are more appreciated on behalf of our political parties. We cannot really have the physical features of the people that are so popular on television among TV viewers, so you might need to accept everybody, nice people and not good-looking people. So elections are a serious matter, so we cannot really have actors discussing the important political subjects that are part of political campaigns. So what does Scerba say? Political elections are a serious matter. We cannot really give them to actors. But today, this is in fact the trend. The candidate must be beautiful, good-looking. Whether he or she knows something of in terms of political subjects and can be a mayor or not, doesn't matter. He says, we are not good looking, we might feel uncomfortable in front of a camera, but what should we do? Should we let some actors speak instead of us? I think this is really important. Then I want to show you a part of a diary by Benedetto Croce. That should be slide 16. 8th of September. And Benedetto Croce wrote, I've been up for some hours between 2 and 5 a.m. with this thought that everything that has been built by Italian generations, politically, economically and morally, has been destroyed, irremediably destroyed. Why am I reading this? Because while Croce wrote this statement, thousands of young people, boys and girls, who did not read Hegel and Kant and decided to join the army to fight. So this means that sometimes the ruling classes do not really know what to do, and it's always important to consider political leaders and ruling class, but also the people, to understand the history of a country. We have tried to give you some ways to understand how to read these two sides of the same coin, the people and the ruling class. The very last item I wanted to discuss concerned today's crisis. Civilizations do not destroy by homicide, but by suicide. No civilization is destroyed. Well, the big societies that had been destroyed, that was due because of internal problems. So it's not just our general problems. These problems that we have are linked to problems of democracy, and we can overcome these problems if we start putting some basic concepts at the center of our life. And these concepts are Republican concepts: solidarity, political participation, and the sense of duty. Feeling part of a community that must go on. We don't have to wait for someone from outside mobilizing us, but we have to be informed, to know more, to make informed choices. And through this process, it is possible to meet the others. Through this process, it is possible to start asking basic questions to political systems and political leaders. So this is a matter of empowerment and self-responsibility for the citizens. So to conclude, I believe that we need more republic and more Republican values in our life and in our country. Thank you. I would like to invite the members of the audience who would like to ask questions to join us on the stage, and you may introduce yourself and then read the question you have. Good evening. I would like to thank you. My name is Elisabetta and I study at the Catholic University. My question is about the exhibition, and I would like to mention the quote present in the first video of Togliatti, who says that after the war, the Italian people didn't have anything to eat, but they had hope. And with this hope, they rebuilt this country. These people only saw destruction, the blood of their brothers and sisters. They didn't have a house or food. Oh, it's really hard for the main speaker to listen to the question because of the acoustic of this room. So repeating this question, there was this hope that led the people to rebuild the country. Good evening, everybody. My name is Marco. I study political sciences in the Statale University in Milan. Thank you very much for your presentation. I also want to refer to the exhibition to understand, to better understand the specific aspect. What is said there is that it's important to go back to the origin in this possibility to meet the other despite the differences. But my question is this: after 70 years of history, in which, in fact, the Italian people at that time, they had nothing to defend, they had everything to build and to gain, but right now I have the feeling it's really, really hard, and we have to consider that we have 70 years of social power structures that are now developed. It's now really hard to set them aside to have a new start. So considering this situation, how can really now go back to the origin? Thank you. Good evening, my name is Luca and I study law in the Statale University in Milan. In your lecture you mentioned at the beginning the civic virtue. What is the origin of this virtue? How is it possible to stimulate it in other people at a time of strong disillusionment and lack of interest? And why should a student like me get involved in the political life of Italy or the world in this moment of big possible changes? Thank you. And the last question? Good evening, my name is Emanuele and I study political studies. Over the first 20 years of the Republic and even beyond that, Italy basically is ruled by a single-party system, basically. Even if there is a lot of instability of the government, but it's always the same character in the top positions of the ministries and in the presidency of the council. Despite this, Italy remains a democracy that is universally acknowledged. So how is this possible? I'm sorry, I couldn't really understand because I couldn't hear properly. There's a really bad acoustic here. So the question is, despite this single-party governance system, how can it be considered a democracy? Okay, thank you very much to all the members of the audience who asked the questions. So the first question, where does hope come from after the war? Well, first of all, it was necessary to rebuild the country, and it was visible that things were being rebuilt. It was not just a feeling, it was concretely done. So when you see, you have tangible evidence that something is being done, then the citizens start doing things, start mobilizing. Of course, there were cases in which people had a house or there was a factory somewhere and there was a hole after bombardments. Well, things were being rebuilt. And so that was the overall situation at that time. There were political forces that they were transmitting hope. This is something that's so important. I am not a Catholic person, but I've learned this from Catholic people. The problem with hope is fundamental. I'm not talking about abstract hope, but it's operational hope. It's an action, it's an example, or words that shake forces and move reactions. At that time, there were political forces that were united. There were the big differences, but they were united to the benefit of the country. And at that time, there was a big strength, a big capacity to deliver a future. People not only wanted a future, but they were really positive that they could build one. Then, as regards the second question, there is basically this fact that when one is hungry, one would start moving faster. So where can we find the strength, even if we're not in a situation where there's destruction around? Well, it's not just a matter of convenience principle. There are things that go beyond convenience principles. Being a citizen is a responsibility. It is a responsibility. So being a man or a woman is a responsibility. I don't want to start addressing issues that I have not enough skills to detail, but we are all part of a community, of a people, and he or she feels better if the others feel better too. One of the negative factors of liberalism is exactly this. It is this social fragmentation. So there is more care for individual interests. Consider advertisements, for example. Car adverts. They keep mentioning to break the rules, of to give room to adventure or to passion. There is nothing pointing to reasoning, reflecting, in being together. I remember that some time ago there was a liquor advert with a van transporting a horse, and they all go and run after the horse, but nobody cares of the driver. So they all celebrate the horse being saved, but nobody wonders what happened to the driver. And why is it so? Because the horse is such a symbol of a masculine feature, and adverts are really interesting in this respect because they really show symptoms of one's times. But if the spirit of a time is direct in a certain way, we can also fight it. What really got the world going on have been minorities, because the minorities were intelligent enough to fight for the cause and try to achieve their objective. Those who sit down and let back, they never change anything.
Io lo so che è difficile.
I know it is hard, but living is not a joke. Living is not easy. Living implies duties, responsibilities, looking beyond what is immediately available. And living is meaningful if it is intended in this way. But if living only means thinking on a daily basis, well, that's not life. Life is much more rewarding the other way. So I understand the sense of this question. I'm grateful to the person who asked it, but it depends on the meaning you attach to your life. If life is commitment, responsibility, trying to do something, well, what of all the volunteers making this possible? Has anybody forced them? No. I think that they have an idea of life, and that's why for 4, 5, 6, 10 days every year they can do this. They can do something for someone else. I go back to the theme of this meeting. It is not embellished expression, you are good for me. This is really a way for possibilities. So I understand the sense of the question, but I do believe that we really have to reflect upon the sense of our own life, and discovering this sense will give you the strength to carry on and to go ahead. Then what about civic virtues? Why does it make sense to commit oneself? Well, the answer basically is probably the same as in the previous question. Life is a commitment. Commitment is not separate from life. Life, to be good, to be lived, must be a commitment, depending on every person's possibility. But, we don't just have to think in a selfish way, accumulating things. Even politics have a pedagogical function. Ruling classes have a big responsibility
Creare opinione.
to create opinion, to make opinions. Unfortunately, I see that a large part of the ruling class and political representatives are so much focused on polls. What is a poll? Well, a poll may give you a sense of what the spirit is at that time, in that moment. Until long ago, politicians were not using polls because politicians were part of society. They really knew what the people were thinking about. They knew the questions, they knew the problems. But when you are not part of that society, you need to know about it through other ways. It really depends on the sense that we attach to our lives. If you have this feeling of doing something for someone else and feeling what your community is going to be in the future, well, the civic community is going to develop, and participation as value is becoming a positive thing. Then there was a specific thing. How was it possible for Christian Democrat Party, that was a single party, then became a sort of authoritarian regime? Well, they had a number of smaller parties that would condition them, would influence them quite a lot. They were not really totally free to do what they wanted. These small parties were needed for a majority. And then, because these currents, while weakening the strength of a political party, would create some sort of balance. So these parties would fuel democracy too. I was not a Christian Democrat, but it was a democratic party. It didn't turn authoritarian because it was a democratic party with all its virtues and the defects, but it was a democratic party. It's not just because there's just one single party in place that it's authoritarian. In the English conservatives are the same, or Angela Merkel does not have a coalition. So it's not that because there's just one single party that we are running a risk for democracy. It depends on the composition of one's party. Even an authoritarian minority party can be dangerous, because authoritarian minorities make things more banal and excessively simplified. And if there is an oversimplification, then you trigger the same mechanisms in the society. Banalization is really, really dangerous. And there's a lesson here I learned from Moro. I've been following Moro for a certain time, graduated in Bari, and I would bring along a penal code book and then a part written in Italian, a book written by Moro in Italian partly and in German. And the clearest part was the one in German. Fair enough. And a friend said, Luciano, you can speak German, why don't you make a summary of this book and then we sell it? And I said, well, I can't really be a salesperson, but I can do that, I can summarize it. And so I spent a whole summer summarizing the part of the book, and I was pretty happy with the result. There were some big issues addressed there. Then I became an assistant professor of penal law. And then at the end of the first term, the secretary said that Aldo Moro was looking for me, and he told me that he was not having royalties on his book, but my publisher told me that nobody has been buying this book I wrote over the last few years, 2 years, and I immediately understood where we were going. So I said, Lucy, a colleague and I wrote a guide on how to study the book, which is a bit difficult, no, to simplify the reading. And he said, no, it's not this. May I teach you something? I want you to have this clear distinction in mind between simplification and banalization. Those who simplify just clean the superficial part, the excessive part, but those that make things more banal, they take the essential things away. So I understood that I didn't simplify, but I did the other thing. So be careful, keep in mind this distinction. I say this especially for the young, and keep the essential, but don't do away with the essentials. So for today's conference, what we have to consider, I think, is that life is a commitment, it is a responsibility, and must be lived fully as a commitment and as a responsibility, both in political and in civic terms. Thank you.
Ringraziamo il Presidente.
We thank the President. I think we had the pleasure to have not just a history and political lecture, but also a lesson for our human values, and I think this is really something special from this meeting. You are a good for me, and Luciano Violante is a good for us.